Robin.
You're listening to Opie and Anthony. On the virus. Sirius XM.
Ah, Mr. Lipton. Pull up a seat. Here we go, sir.
Doesn't smell my
Please
farts.
feel free to
fart.
pull up a seat. And what do we got there? Got the water, a little microphone. My goodness. We were just commenting. We're on the air, by the way. We just wing it like this.
Might put these on?
If you feel,
want to, you don't have
yeah,
to.
yeah,
You don't have to if you don't want to.
As long as you could hear us, that's fine. We don't mind. Well, obviously, we were astounded by the list of people you have interviewed. It's quite extensive and an amazing array of celebrities. When did you start interviewing people in this fashion?
Well, 19 years ago.
That's it.
In 1994, when the Earth was covered in mists, I had an idea, as a member of the Actors Studio, that we ought to create a degree-granting program for the first time in the history of the studio, which was then 47 years old. And you know the people that had given us, from James Dean and Paul Newman and Marlon Brando and so forth, right up through Pacino and through De Niro and Jack Nicholson, etc. And I suggested at that time that the studio, first of all, was a very private place. It was a gymnasium, and nobody was allowed in from the outside. It was a place where people could go and make mistakes. Why? Because you learn from your mistakes, right? But you don't want to make them in public once you're famous. So that's how it worked. I said, why don't we create a degree-granting program for the first time? We don't have to let people in. The studio is still on 44th Street. It's still a private, cranky place where nobody can get in. But let's let this method that has been honed all these years out in an educational environment. And that was how we started Actors Studio Drama School, which is now at Pace University. And when we started the Actors Studio Drama School, I had people who would... All of our core courses, by the way, are taught by life members of the Actors Studio. That way we get the continuity that we wanted. And so we had people who would teach 30 weeks. People would come in and do 6 Fridays in a workshop. But there was one category left that was unfilled, and that was those people who were members of the studio or friends of ours or colleagues with whom we've worked who could only give us one night of their lives. So I sent a letter out and said, will you come and teach our students for one night? Paul Newman answered, Dennis Hopper answered, Sally Field answered. I got these extraordinary people saying, yes, we'll do it. And that's when I sent word back into the professional community. I was by now dean of the Actors Studio Drama School, which I had created it, so they said, well, you'll give it a year. Start it, you know.
How long had you been at the studio by this time? Had you been there since the beginning?
Only 2 years I'd been there by then. I was trained by Stella Adler and Harold Klerman. And so I got these responses, and I sent word back into the professional community from which I had come. And I said, look, these people are liable to say something worth preserving. And anybody interested, because that means television cameras. And Bravo took the existential leap with me. At that time, Bravo had 20 million people. That is to say, and Cablevision. They were owned by Cablevision. There were 20 million subscribers. Today, we are in 94 million homes on Bravo. We are in 125 countries. We have a record-breaking 15 Emmy nominations. And if you had put a gun to my head in 1994 and said, predict that or die, I would have said, pull the trigger.
Can I ask, when you do such an amazing prep for these interviews, do publicists give you the same thing they give us? Well, you can't ask about this, you can't ask. What are the parameters you allow?
We are about to do our 250th episode. Wow. Not one publicist has ever told me I can or cannot do anything. Not one. There is no pre-interview on our show. We're the only talk show of our kind that has no pre-interview. That's why I have to work for 2 weeks to do those 300 or 400 cards all by myself.
Wow.
And the result of that has been that the guest walks in and has absolutely no idea what's coming next. That's the rigid rule on our show, and nobody has ever asked to violate it. Not once.
I'm amazed by that.
That level of trust
so
they
am I.
have for you.
It's trust and...
Well, they know that we're going to talk about craft. We're not interested in gossip.
Right.
We're a master's degree program. Those are master's degree candidates sitting out there at Pace University. And so they know that we're not going to get into gossip. We don't care about it. We really don't care, seriously. And what do we care about? We care about the work they've done. And if I were to ask you or anybody in this room, look, I'm going to interview you. And what we'll talk about, I'm just going to ask you about those turning points in your life that made you whoever the hell you are now. Both as an artist in the case of our show, and as a person. And you start, and I've done my research, and I know that there was a turning point. Somebody died, therefore they did this. And so I asked them, I describe to me what happened, and then they tell me what happened, and in doing so, what happens? It's called effective memory in the Stanislavski system. What happens is the emotions that they felt at the time begin to come back, and as a result, we became, to my absolute astonishment, the most intimate and the most emotional show of our kind.
Who gave you the most emotional interview that you can think of, or one
Bradley
that
Cooper.
was... Yeah?
Look, when I was asked over and over again, over the years, who's the guest you want the most? I said, look, I was for 10 years the dean of the Actors Studio Drama School. I was its founding dean. I'm no longer its dean. I'm dean emeritus. And I said, the night that one of my graduated students has achieved so much that he or she walks out on that stage and sits down in that chair next to me is going to be the night I've waited for since we started this program. Wow. And Bradley Cooper graduated in 2000. We trained him for 3 years. And when Bradley walked out on that stage, he looked at me and I looked at him. We burst into tears and we had to...
Wow.
We couldn't go on with the show for a bit until both of us had recovered. So there is that kind of emotional attachment in the show that, again, doesn't make us better. I hope it doesn't make us worse, but it sure as hell makes us different.
Yeah, and it's honest. I mean, obviously, not talking about the gossipy end of it, just the craft, and just open honesty about it. I think people feel safe there, too. It doesn't feel like they're going to be blindsided by some TMZ reporter.
No, because look, we're a master's class in a university. We don't care about those things. Yeah. Our students don't care. They would be disappointed in me if I asked a question about that had nothing to do with the reason that we're all there. And the result for us, for our students, remember, they come from we're in 125 countries. That's not a joke. We were immense in France, in Japan, in Australia, in the Scandinavian countries, in Latin America. The show is just huge. And the result is that our students come to us from all over the world, and they come to us for a reason. And the guests know that there's a reason. And therefore the guests have a reason for coming there, which is to teach them. And it turned out, I thought it would be so dull. I thought it would be so dry. I thought we wouldn't last a year. I'm serious. I thought we wouldn't last a year. Here we are, 19 years, the second longest running show in the history of cable television. All of these things, it sounds like I'm bragging. Maybe I am. But it's also the truth. And it's not something that I had anticipated or even planned. It just evolved organically, the way an acting role is supposed to evolve.
Yeah. How did you accept being thrust into pop culture like that? I mean, the parodies that have been done about you, which are hilarious.
It appears that it appears that I am a figure in pop culture.
Sure.
Watch Arrested Development when it comes back on the air on Netflix. I'm back on the show. The Warden Gentles, like the character that I created on the original show. I'm back on the air. The Will Ferrell, of course. We all know about that. And it's not something that I can plan, but it is something that, to be perfectly frank, that I treasure.
Yeah.
I mean, Will's a friend. He asked me to be in his movie with him, which I did, and this thing has evolved too over the years. This relationship. Do I like it? People ask me, do you hate it? Hate it? I would crawl on broken glass to have this kind of thing happen to me.
It must have been odd, though, to be the dean of a university.
It's all happening at once. I was one of 7 deans in a university, which is an academic position, of course, and at the same time, all this madness was happening.
Yeah. That's an amazing story.
Of all the people you've talked to, what was something that shocked you? Like, what's a piece of information somebody gave you?
The most shocking one, I think. Well, brace yourselves. It's quite a tale. It's brief. Jack Lemmon was on. I'd known Jack Lemmon when I was a young actor and came to New York, and he was already a famous actor. And Jack was, you may know, an absolutely elegant human being. And it was near the end of his life, just a few months from the end of his life, and he was on the show. And because I'm dean of the school, I'm always trying to make a point for the actors. I'm didactic, which is one of the things people make fun of me for, and some people dislike me for. They think it makes me pompous. And but I'm always trying to teach them something. And so I was working with Jack, and we were talking about Days of Wine and Roses. And I said to him, you know, all the famous scenes in it, the scene next to the crib with the child, the scene in the greenhouse when you smash it, trying to find a bottle that you stowed there, the scene when you're arrested, all those huge scenes, emotional scenes. But the most moving, the most thrilling scene in the movie is the quietest. When you stand up in front of AA for the first time and say those historic words, and then I paused. I'm always trying to get my guest. I tried to get De Niro to say, "You're talking to me," he wouldn't do it. I did get Tom Hanks to say, "Life is like a box of chocolates." And I waited for him to say it, and he said it. He said, "My name is," he couldn't recall it, and he said, "My name is so-and-so, and I'm an alcoholic." And I turned to the students and I said, see, look, no pushing, no begging for anything. Just do it. Just do what the character does and let the audience provide the emotion. See, no pushing. I said, that's acting. And he said, no, it's not. I'm an alcoholic.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And there follows a 15-second pause, which I kept in the edit because I edited the show. And it's right there, and we just stare at each other. And I saw he didn't want to go any further, and so I went on to the next question. But it was the most startling moment in the history of the show. Wow. And afterward, his wife said to me in the green room, first time Jack's ever said that in public.
Wow. So the fact that he said that, I guess, obviously meant he was in recovery and had kept that private. Wow, that's...
He was, but he had never admitted to it in public in his life until that moment. Would you call that a surprise?
Yeah. Well, not in this studio, I wouldn't. You know,
come on, I enjoy a couple of beers myself, but
you're an interesting guy too. In that you how much of this is folklore? But back in France, when you were a younger guy, you know what is this? Are they?
God, are you going there? Okay,
we have to ask. Yeah, you were. Go ahead. You were. I don't want to say a pimp per se, but
I was a macro. Which is not strictly speaking a pimp. A pimp is somebody who exploits the women who work for him, and generally speaking, that relationship nowadays it's unthinkable. Unthinkable. I'm talking about when I was a youngster. This is long, long ago, where it was all regulated in France and so forth. But a pimp exploits the women and often treats them horribly. We know that. But a macro works for the women. They employ him. And I was living in Paris. I couldn't get a work permit. It was out of the question in those days.
Were you acting there while you were there?
I had been acting in Greece in a film. And then I came back, and I didn't want to come back to the United States for a while. I wanted to live in Europe, and I particularly wanted to live in Paris. This an expression in French called rite de passage, rites of passage. I was going through it, and I wanted to continue to go through it. And I had met by chance, because I had gone, as Americans did in those days, to the Rue Pigalle to see a sex exhibition, which was in those days was commonplace in Paris, and in America didn't exist at all. And afterward, I had had a drink in the bar in the bordello and met the young woman who had participated in this, and we became friends. She was from Cannes. She was a beautiful young Canoise. And in those days, France was going through a very hard time, and the men couldn't get work, and certainly the women couldn't. And there was no opprobrium associated with women who went into what was called le milieu, which is that world, and then came out of it. The names I could name for you, movie stars and so forth in France, who were in it for a time. And there was nothing. There were students who were in it, who were earning their way through school, women who were supporting their husbands who were going to college, for example. Wow. It was an entirely different world and completely regulated, medically regulated and everything. Anyway, then when I ran out of money, she suggested that I would become her mech so that I could stay there and we could continue our friendship and our relationship. And I did. And it was one of the most interesting years of my life. Now you know the whole story.
Wow.
But
what is one of the responsibilities of
I would go to the
probably not mopping up.
In the morning. I would appear at American Express, which is where all the tourists turned up, especially the American tourists, right next to the Palais Garnier. And to the Paris Opera, and other people would be there saying, "Would you like? I conduct tours. Would you like to see Chartres? Would you like to see Notre Dame de Paris, etc." All these people would be these tour guides. I was a tour guide. I would say, "You want to see some sex?" and these startled Americans would say, "Yes, this is really what they came to Paris for in those days." And then
when was this roughly?
1950s.
Oh, okay.
And so France was still recovering from the Second World War, and I would have to go with them because they were nervous, they were frightened about it, and so I would take them there to the bordello, and my girlfriend and another woman or a man or whatever it was we had arranged, this thing would occur, and these people were electrified by it. And they would ask me to translate for them and speak to these people and tell them what they wanted to see and so forth. So it was a very strange time in my life, but it was literally the only way I could remain in France. I couldn't earn a living any other way. I would gladly have done something else.
Now that's probably a much more fun way to make a living.
Well,
did you get involved?
Interesting.
Were you a part of
What do you mean by get involved?
Well, what I would love to have
No, man, she was my girlfriend, for Christ's sake.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to, betray her even with her.
Wow.
You follow me? It's very complicated.
You didn't get jealous?
No. No. Well, she wasn't. We were friends. We were really friends. More than anything else.
Right, yeah.
And she had arranged for this. It had to be arranged for her. They would have found me floating in the sand because you couldn't practice that profession unless you had been endorsed. Okay. And so she got me endorsed.
Wow. What a great story.
I've never discussed this with anybody else before on radio.
It's quite amazing. Part of your history and just part of history. We never do that.
Well, I never would have discussed it at all. I did in my memoir, Inside.
Yeah.
It's there in black and white for everybody to read. But Arthur Lawrence, the great playwright, had been there. And with a whole group of people, with Stella Adler, who was my acting teacher, and they were all there in Paris. They came for the summer, and I was there, and that was when I was working. And they asked me to, and I took them all and arranged one for them, this as a sex exhibition. And Arthur wrote about it in his memoir.
Oh, really?
Yeah, 6 years ago, just before I wrote my memoir. And he talked about it, and so I felt he had outed me.
Did he drop your name in there?
Drop my name?
I thought maybe it was an anonymous type.
No, he devoted a chapter. He called me.
He didn't mention your name. The guy who hosts the Actors Studio.
No, I wasn't that then. He called me the sex guide.
Wow.
Of Paris. And so once that had been done, there was nothing I could do about it except in my memoir to put it on record truthfully, once and for all. When Julia Roberts was on my show years ago, and Julia had played, of course, a prostitute famously. And I said, did you interview prostitutes? And so well, she said yes, and we got into that. And then I began to talk about, I said, well, when I was in France, and so forth. And then I realized I had trapped myself. That was long before I ever discussed it. And I didn't want to go any further with it. And Julia, she started laughing. She couldn't stop laughing. And it's one of the most famous moments on the show where I was just sort of fumbling around and I didn't know what to say or how to get out of it. And Julia could not stop laughing. I tried to drink her water and her teeth were rattling on the glass.
She let you off the hook, or she probably could have pursued it. Oh, she didn't.
But I didn't confess anything.
Right.
It wasn't until Arthur Lawrence wrote about it as an experience of his life that I decided I'd better set the record straight, such as it is.
It's an interesting story, and you know what? It's in a time in history where it doesn't seem as seedy as anything like that now.
Listen, the women who were in the milieu in those days were, some of them were very, very elegant, and as I say, they were examined weekly by a doctor. It was completely regulated. Some of the bordellos of that time were among the most famous in the history of the world. These women were like geishas, and they were so royally treated, and as I said, women moved in and out. They needed the money. They were desperate, and so they would do this for a while. Then they would come out of it. People wouldn't know that they were in it. There's a very famous French movie star who was in and out of that milieu. I won't say who it was, and that's not my right. But I know that she was. And when they came out of it, there was no opprobrium whatsoever. People never even gave it a thought.
Wow.
The French have always been look. We're the United States of America.
We're uptight.
What tradition do we have that the French do not have? The Puritan tradition. There is a Puritan tradition in America, which we inherited from England. But the Catholic countries of Europe, France and Italy and so forth, do not have a Puritan tradition. As a result, they look, and neither does Asia, neither does Japan, for example. And so in those countries, you don't find the same kind of nervousness or obsession with sex. They're much less, much less obsessed.
Less uptight, too. Just less uptight.
One of the problems
with
the Catholic Church today is that it has become absolutely riveted on the subject of sex.
Right, yeah.
And I'm not criticizing them, that's their right. But it is a fact. And they are more sophisticated perhaps about it, or and certainly more casual about it. They don't see it as every encounter as a life-changing event.
Sure.
I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but it's different from our own tradition. We are more uptight, and it has to do with our Puritan tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it takes away from some things that could be, art. I think it takes away from art in this country a lot.
Look at Japanese art, the greatest Japanese artists, the Rembrandts and the Da Vinci's of Japan, all painted pornography, pure graphic pornography. My wife is half Japanese and half Irish, and she studied art with a great Japanese artist. He was a national treasure. They declare them national treasures in Japan. And he gave her as a gift once. It hangs in our house. This painting by a master, one of the 18th century masters of Japanese painting, and it is a pure pornographic
and it has a place in your home right there prominently displayed?
Pride of place.
You see? Wonderful. I love it.
Why not?
Absolutely. Why not? Absolutely.
Did you study with, did Brando study with Stella Adler too?
Brando studied with Stella Adler, De Niro studied with Stella Adler, Harvey Keitel studied with Stella Adler. I studied with her for 2.5 years. She taught for 2 years, and actually she asked me to stay for another 6 months, which I did and worked with her. She was the greatest single academic influence on my life.
So you knew Brando?
Yes, I knew Brando when I first came to New York. He was already, a star, but I did know him quite well. Yeah.
I'm always fascinated with people who got to know him because he seems like one of these guys that was rather difficult to get to know.
At the end of his life, I was always trying to get him to be on the inside the actor's studio. By then, he was reclusive, and he would sit up in his home, and he would make phone calls. He would call me, and we would talk for 45 minutes, but he would never appear on the show. By then, he would not come out of his house, and he was very, very, very bizarre. He speak to me in Spanish. And I said, I don't speak Spanish. And then he would stop. But we used to talk for a long time. I said, why don't we say this on the air, for God's sake?
Right.
And nobody wouldn't do it. So he's one that got away. But by then, it wouldn't have been very valuable anyway, because he had spit the bit. And he was no longer interested in acting, and he contemned it, and he hated himself, as we all know. It ended poorly. But when I first saw him, when I first came to New York, I saw him in Streetcar.
Oh, wow.
And he was the greatest actor I ever saw.
Did he really dislike guys like Rod Steiger? Because there's this famous story about when they were doing that, I Could Have Been a Contender, Charlie, that he wouldn't even do Rod's close-ups with him, that he hated his acting. Is that the truth?
I have no idea. I don't know. I don't answer that. I don't know that he did. But certainly that scene is justly famous. He did everything wrong in it. He did everything unpredictable in it. Instead of being angry at his brother, instead of being frightened of his brother, the two things that you would think that any actor would have chosen, made those choices in the scene, his brother was destroying him at that moment. What was he instead? He was heartbroken. He was heartbroken that his brother would do this. It was the most amazing choice, and only a Brando could have made it. I think that nothing impresses me in an actor more than risk. If an actor takes chances and is utterly unpredictable, then I know I'm in the presence of a great actor. And there's one more ingredient that's necessary. If the actor... First, you are absolutely startled by his choices or her choices, and in the end, you realize they were what? Inevitable. That's what makes a great actor, and that's why Brando, to my taste, is the greatest of his time. And we have some great ones going now.
Who do you think's unpredictable now? Like completely, who shot
Philip
you?
Seymour Hoffman.
Yeah.
There you go.
He is good. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Did Brando ever talk about acting and the actual craft of acting in public in any way?
Yeah, he decided after I started Inside the Actors Studio. I think he was inspired by it because he's a member of the Actors Studio. He was so aware of it. He decided he was going to teach a class in Los Angeles. Advertisements went out. People flocked. And they rushed to be taught by Marlon Brando. And they arrived at the appointed place, and he was waited for the door to open for him to come in. He walked in a dress, as I recall. It lasted, I think, about 24 hours.
That was it.
By then he was two.
Yeah,
He hated acting.
Isn't that odd?
He thought that acting was not a worthy profession. And you know why? Because he was a genius. Geniuses make one mistake consistently. They think that whatever they do is easy. Why? Because it's easy for them. And they didn't have to learn it because it came from instinctively. And as a result, they think it's easy, and it's easy for them to become contemptuous of it. Because, look, I'm doing this thing. What's so special about what I'm doing? Why should anybody make a fuss? And eventually, people like Brando become contemptuous of it. For example, Ted Williams had to teach himself every moment of swinging a bat. He could teach you how to swing a bat because he had to teach himself. He wasn't a genius. What he was a great student, and he taught himself how to do it. Willie Mays never gave it a minute's thought in his life. He was a genius. It just happened. He would get up there, he'd swing the bat, and he'd hit a home run. There are those two kinds of those two approaches to a craft. And Marlon was absolutely a genius. He just was able to do it. Now, he was well trained by Stella Adler. He had a thorough training from her. When you put together technique with talent, you can't teach talent. Talent's what you bring to the table. And
I wonder what that's like.
Yeah, exactly.
I said, I wonder what that's like.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you know. And, but you put together talent and technique, and then out comes a Brando.
You know, I can't even watch movies like Miracle on 34th Street was on recently, and I just can't watch things from that era anymore. Because, again, like watching guys like Brando and like Hoffman or whoever, I can't watch the old school acting anymore. It just seems so disconnected to anything I enjoy.
Because it was English acting. Until the Stanislavski system took hold in America through the group theater, out of which came Stella Adler and Lee Strasberg and all the teachers whom I have studied with. Until then, it was a pale imitation of English theater. They had a kind of false English accent.
Yeah.
Everything had to look good, and they practiced in front of a mirror until they had themselves just the way they wanted. None of it was organic. None of it was felt. None of it was emotional. None of it was real. It was all a system of posing. It was rhetorical. It was essentially false.
Very much like old stage acting.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
It was theater acting.
Yeah,
they took it to film. But then when the Moscow Art Theater on Stanislavski came here in the 1920s, there was a revolution, and that was when Strasberg and Stella Adler and Harold Clurman and Cheryl Crawford, they saw what was happening on that stage, and they knew that the door had opened, it would never close again. And then they founded the group theater. Out of that came the plays of Odets. Out of that came all of our greatest actors. And today it is it's transcendent in the world. There is no actor who is not touched by it in one way or another. And in America, we've had some very, very, very great teachers. The greatest of whom I thought was Stella Adler, and she did teach Brando. And once again, there with me, I brought a minimal talent to it, so I was okay. But he brought this great talent, put it together with her technique, and out came a very great actor.
This footage of... they say with the...
Yeah, unfortunately.
I just want to ask one more question. Did they say this footage... I'm not a fan of Shakespeare. I can't enjoy it, but I watched Brando doing, like, the Caesar. He was Mark Anthony, I think he was doing,
yeah.
and I couldn't take my eyes off it because it was like, this is the only guy I've ever seen do it.
Neither could the English actors. I remember once one of the English actors on my show, was it Tony Hopkins or John Hurt? I've forgotten which one it was. Or Ian McKellen. They said to me, "Look at the Julius Caesar. You'll see what Brando was doing." Here we all came with this classical training, with the perfect body, the perfect voice, the perfect behavior, and Brando came on that screen, and we were all of us in the shadow. And he was able to bring to it the kind of deeply felt emotions of American training and acting. When applied to Shakespeare, who was a great writer of emotion, a great writer of feeling, a great writer of character, and when you put those two together, then you've got a performance like Brando's. But I mean, others do it very well. I think Tony Hopkins is a perfect combination. When he was on my show, he told me that while he was studying at the Royal Academy in London, learning the kind of acting that we all associate with Shakespeare and with the English tradition, he was sneaking off and studying Stanislavski with an acting teacher in London, and putting the two of them together. And when you put that exterior technique, which is external, in which certain aspects of a character are acquired externally, together with an internal technique that digs deep into your own soul and makes you recreate whatever it was that Shakespeare wrote and said organically from your own life experience and from your own deepest, the marrow of your bones, then you get the kind of exquisite acting that all of us can react to and never forget.
Yeah. Wow. So rare to see.
They're telling us what they
oh, yeah.
You're other press to
you got a lot more press to do.
You're very busy today, apparently.
James is promoting, of course, Inside the Actors Studio. It's an amazing show. You get more out of actors.
You watch Tina Fey, which is tomorrow night on Bravo. And we talked about what? Improvisation. Because she came from Second City.
Sure.
She gives a lesson in improvisation that is incomparable. And guess what? We then improvised, and I was allowed by her to interview Sarah Palin.
Oh, she does.
Watch it. Yep, she does. Sarah, we do about 8 minutes together of Sarah Palin, and it is absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah,
it's improvisation.
Totally improvising.
We're both improvising.
Tomorrow night, that's 8 o'clock on Bravo. It's season 19, and you're an amazing interviewer and a great guest, and
Yeah, thanks so much.
What you get out of actors is amazing. No one gets that
coming in
stuff out of them.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Thanks for coming in.
And I think a great interviewer gets things out of people. Like, some people got James to talk about things that he hasn't talked about.
Right, Jimmy.
Yeah. My wife is, if she hears this, she's going to kill me.
Meanwhile, you should have maybe gotten an acting lesson from him instead of acting.
Yeah, I really should have. I do things that are unpredictable, too. I forget the lines, and when I do remember, I suck.
Jimmy has a problem. He doesn't know what to do with his hands to make them look natural as he's acting.
Yes.
He's either by there or fault.
Hands are the problem. Look at, you watch Humphrey Bogart. Bogart never figured out what to do with his hands. He usually tucks them into the belt of his pants.
Really? Bogart couldn't even figure it out?
He watch him. He was never comfortable with his hands.
I find that, like, what I'll do is I'll just put them over my head out of frame, and people just forget that they exist.
That's why in the K Mutiny he was doing that with the Marls, but he just brought those one day. It wasn't even part of the script.
Oh, you're right.
It's absolutely not true.
All right, well,
let's get James Lipton out of here.
Thank you, James, very much.
Thank you all.
All right.
Tell him, Fred.
The Virus. Sirius XM. This